As far back as, 17th century England, there was a law that said that a man could beat his wife with a stick so long as it wasn't thicker than his thumb, and we still have that idea today. So when we talk about things like Cell 16 and Brooklyn Women's Martial Arts and other forms of feminist self-defense, we shouldn't look at it as just a physical self-defense, but also this growing recognition that there are all sorts of ways that violence impacts women's lives. We need to make sure that people who might be abusive and violent know that every eye on the community is on them. Prisons and policing often protect those in power and do very little to nothing to those who, for those who don't have any power. So they might decide that they don't necessarily need to act or intervene in some cases. Andrea Smith, one of the co-founders of Insight, actually talked about one very public incident in which a woman who was in a housing project in a city called the police because of a domestic violence incident with her partner. And when the police arrived, they looked around the projects and decided that, no, this woman actually didn't qualify for their protection. They didn't want to enter the public housing area to try to ascertain what was going on and possibly arrest the person who had abused her. And she got incensed and asked for their badge number, and they decided that they were going to further brutalize her by beating her and arresting her and taking her in on some bogus charge because she had demanded that they offer her the same protection that they would a white middle-class woman living in an affluent suburban neighborhood. We've also seen that it's especially in communities where the police are not seen as protectors, like low-income communities of color or poor neighborhoods, that for a woman to call the police and invite them into the neighborhood often ostracizes her from the rest of the community. So the community will see her as calling the police in to further terrorize the community. And so whatever support she might have gotten from her friends and her neighbors and her coworkers and everybody else in the neighborhood disappears when she calls the police in. So all these factors put women more at risk when they call in the police. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the abuse is going to stop, because either the police showing up and arresting the person right then and there and taking him out of commission for 24 hours, or the police arresting this person and then pressuring the woman to file charges and often holding threats of perhaps removing her children or doing something else over her head. Communities haven't been able to develop or haven't developed other means to solve, interpersonal violence or abuse. So therefore, if the only solution seems to be to call in the police, then the police can use this then as a way to say, well, we have to be in these higher crime or higher violence communities to prevent violence, without actually addressing all the other ways that violence can take place without necessarily it being like one person physically hurting another person. I don't want to pinpoint one as the root cause, but some of the root causes are this idea that women are the property of men. So as far back as, 17th century England, there was a law that said that a man could beat his wife with a stick so long as it wasn't thicker than his thumb, and we still have that idea today that women are somehow the property of the men that they are in relationships with, whether it be their fathers or their husbands or their boyfriends or their sons. There's this idea that it is okay to exert power by any means necessary, whether it be like physical abuse or emotional abuse or mental abuse or controlling someone economically. In East Harlem in New York, which is a primarily black and brown poor community in New York City, residents formed what they called, neighborhood watches, where they would actually go to the apartment of somebody who was involved in a domestically violent situation, either because the woman asked them to or because a neighbor called in a complaint. And they actually went to the apartment and they physically moved themselves in to the apartment for a while. And obviously they couldn't live in this apartment forever, but they would be there for a few days, and the abusive partner would know that he couldn't do anything while they were there, and even after they'd moved out, he knew that they could come back, and that basically the community had taken it upon itself to say that we won't stand for this kind of violence and this kind of abuse anymore. In the mid-1990s, there was a group called Sister to Sister, S-I-S-T-A, not S-I-S-T-E-R, which is a group of predominantly black and brown women in the Bushwick area, and they recognized that they had to address interpersonal violence and state violence. So one of the things that they did was they started the sister circles, understanding that they couldn't necessarily rely on the police to help them, especially when police were coming into their communities, and murdering people. So 2 young women of color were murdered around 2000 by the police, and there was like no, like huge state outcry. There was no big shakeup about the fact that the police had murdered 2 young women. But they also recognized that there was a lot of interpersonal and violence that was going on that needed to be addressed as well. So they started forming what they call the sister circles, in which they actually talked to each other, and they devised ways in which they could address abuse without relying on policing in prisons. And one example that was given was one of the women came to the sister circles and said, my ex-boyfriend has been stalking me, he's been like psychologically intimidating me, and I'm getting worried that this is going to keep escalating until he becomes physically violent with me. And they talked with her, and they devised a plan, and I'm going to like shorten the version because I'm sure a lot of planning went on. It wasn't like they just like automatically had this instinct. And what they did was they went and they confronted him at the barber shop where he worked in front of all his coworkers and said, look, this is what you're doing to this woman, you need to stop. And what happened was that the men in the barber shop that worked with him said, hey, that's really messed up, you need to stop. And his boss even said, if I hear about this again, you're fired. Like, you are not going to be harassing this woman anymore. And this is the kind of thing that they were doing because they couldn't rely on the police to keep them safe. Cell 16 was a women's liberation group. It actually was formed in the late 1960s, and I think maybe by the early 1970s had disbanded. But during their time, they were based in the Boston area of Massachusetts. They did several things. They did patrols of areas in which working class women were getting out of factory shifts late at night. So they understood that women who didn't have resources to, say, like, have somebody come pick them up or didn't have their own cars were vulnerable to violence when they were getting off their factory shifts late at night and walking to the public transportation. So what they would do is they would patrol in pairs or in groups, and they would offer to walk women to where they were going. So whether it be walking them to the train station and making sure they safely got into the train station, or walking them to their houses to make sure, again, like the sisterhood societies, that they were safe from external threats, relying on this idea that there's safety in numbers. And they would watch out for suspicious behavior, and it's not the same type of suspicious behavior that the government tells you to like look for today, but like, hey, there's this man that seems to be standing there, for absolutely no intent, no purpose. Like, what are his intentions? Is he going to assault somebody, or is he waiting for his girlfriend or his wife to get off of work? But actually putting potential assailants on notice too, that there were people involved in, like in watching out for everyone's safety. They also were one of the first women's groups to offer self-defense classes for women with a feminist slant. So they actually said, women have the right to be safe and secure in their own bodies, and they need to have the skill set and the tools to be able to defend themselves physically if they're attacked. And so they offered free taekwondo classes to women so that women could learn to defend themselves, and they weren't always needing to rely on somebody else to do so. In 1974 and 1975, going on this same premise that women have the right to be safe and secure in their own bodies, 2 feminist martial arts activists, Nadia Telsey and Annie Ellman, started Brooklyn Women's Martial Arts in Brooklyn, New York. And they basically started the first dojo specifically for women, in which they wanted women to be able to train and learn how to defend themselves. They made it sliding scale so that if a woman couldn't afford to pay for classes, she didn't have to, or if she could only afford to pay a little bit, she could, and women who could afford to pay more did. And they also offered childcare at all of their classes, understanding that they didn't want women with children to say, well, I can't take these classes because I don't have a safe place to put my child or my children, and also understanding that when women become mothers, they're just as vulnerable, if not more vulnerable, to violence because, they don't necessarily have all the access and resources and mobility that, single women might. So, and this is, their dojo has continued on to this day. In the 1980s, they renamed themselves the Center for Anti-Violence Education, recognizing that it's not just women who face violence. So they actually started doing trainings for transgendered people. They started doing trainings for, after 9/11, they started doing trainings for groups that were specifically working with South Asian populations that were more vulnerable to the racist backlash post 9/11, and like how to like deal with safety and security, not just from the physical aspect, but also tactics like de-escalation, knowing what to look for, like trying to get a situation away from a dangerous place without actually having to use your fists. It also recognized that violence was one of the things that held all these different types of oppressions together. So they weren't just focusing on violence against women and whitewashing this idea of women, but they were understanding that women with the least amount of resources were the most vulnerable to violence. So women of color would be vulnerable not only to interpersonal violence, but were more vulnerable to state violence as well, and violence from the police, and weren't necessarily in positions to be able to call the police. Poor women were less likely to be able to get away because they were poor and they didn't have the resources and opportunities to do so. And so they did a lot of work around also educating people around the fact that there are all these different oppressions that intersect, and then you can see violence as one of the glues that hold together all these oppressions.